Welcome to This Explainer. Whenever I look at a massive new highway, a towering hydroelectric dam, or a sprawling industrial complex, I always wonder who actually decided it was safe to build this right here. Well, the truth is, massive infrastructure projects don't just happen by accident. Way before a single shovel ever hits the dirt, these projects are put through a rigorous, globally recognized scientific and regulatory gauntlet. This process literally decides whether they live, change, or die. So today we're going to break down the anatomy of the Environmental Impact Assessment, or the EIA. Let's dive right in and see how this rigorous methodology actually operates in the real world.
To really understand the gravity of the EIA, we've got to look at its foundation. We can trace this whole concept back to the historic 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. This is where the EIA was formally recognized on the global stage. Principle 17 of the Rio Declaration explicitly states that an EIA must be undertaken as a national instrument for any proposed activity likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment. And look, this wasn't just some polite recommendation, right? It established a concrete, universal standard for environmental accountability, demanding that competent national authorities step up and make the hard decisions. So here is our syllabus for today. We're going to distill a pretty dense 11-step regulatory methodology into 6 clear phases: the origins of the EIA, scoping and baseline data, assessing and evaluating impacts, alternatives and mitigation strategies, management and monitoring plans, and finally, the review and final decision. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the origins of the EIA.
Think of the EIA as essentially an 11-step shield for the environment. Conducting one is a massive logistical challenge that weaves together science, engineering, economics, and even sociology. These 11 interconnected steps are designed with one primary goal in mind: to ensure that decision-makers hear, quantify, and address absolutely every valid environmental concern before breaking ground. It literally forces developers to look before they leap.
Moving right along to part 2, scoping and baseline data. Because honestly, the very first question any scientist or engineer has to ask is, where do we even begin looking for impacts? The answer to that is found in our first 2 vital steps: scoping and baseline data collection. Scoping is all about setting the study's boundaries. A team holds discussions with various groups to make sure they cover all the critical issues that decision-makers are liable to raise. They're actively selecting the primary impacts that require focus. Once that scope is locked in, we move to step 2, which is baseline data. This is where analysts gather all the relevant data about the existing physical, biological, and socioeconomic conditions. We are essentially establishing the before picture, so we can accurately measure any changes caused by the project later on. Just to put this into perspective and give you a sense of scale, let's look at how baseline data is applied in practice. Under current regulations in India, for example, baseline data collection isn't just about the immediate footprint of a building. Not at all. It actually demands the assessment of a radius of 10 to 25 kilometers around the project site. This sheer magnitude brilliantly illustrates the depth of these studies. It has to take into account current and proposed development activities within that entire radius, even if they aren't directly connected to the project itself. We're looking at vast, complex ecosystems here, not just a couple of construction plots. Which brings us to part 3, assessing and evaluating impacts. Basically, what is this proposed project actually going to do to the local communities, the rivers, the air quality, and the wildlife? Now we hit steps 3 and 4, assessment and evaluation. First, the team identifies, predicts, and assesses both the positive and negative impacts. They compile a list of all the project's impact sources and match them with possible receptors in the environment. And, most importantly, they predict the extent of these impacts and put hard numbers to them. Then, in the evaluation phase, they ask a crucial question: are these predicted adverse impacts significant enough to demand mitigation? This isn't based on gut feeling either. It relies strictly on regional laws, accepted scientific standards, preset criteria, and crucial check-ins regarding acceptability to the local community. Let's move to part 4, alternatives and mitigation strategies. This is the stage where engineering and environmental science collaborate to find actionable solutions. Look, the initial proposal is rarely the only option, right? So step 5 is the analysis of alternatives. Analysts systematically compare feasible alternatives for the site itself, the technology being used, the design, and the operation. They're comparing capital and recurrent costs and their suitability under local conditions. But perhaps the most vital comparison here is the with or without project situation.
analysts have to scientifically evaluate what happens to the environment if the project is simply never built at all. This serves as the ultimate control scenario. Now, if the project is going to move forward, we hit step 6, the delineation of mitigation procedures. A really wide range of measures is proposed to prevent, reduce, remedy, or compensate for every single adverse impact we identified earlier. This could mean introducing strict pollution controls and waste treatment. It could involve phased implementation, landscaping, or personnel training. And when damage is absolutely unavoidable, mitigation might require offering compensation, restoring damaged resources, creating off-site community enhancement programs, or providing special social services and public education. It's a really comprehensive toolkit to balance development with preservation.
On to part 5, management and monitoring plans. Sure, all these mitigation strategies sound fantastic on paper, but how do we actually guarantee the project keeps its environmental promises over time?
Well, that's where steps 7 and 8 come into play. First, we have the specification of the environmental monitoring program. This dictates the exact tracking measures that must be taken at the institutional level during both the construction and operation phases. It ensures adverse impacts are kept to acceptable levels. Right after that, the study team formulates the environment management plan by comparing various measures and carefully weighing the trade-offs between them to propose one unified, solid course of action.
And that brings us to a really critical definition you should know. The Environment Management Plan, or EMP, is the culmination of everything we've discussed so far. It is an elaborate, heavily documented action plan that meets environmental exigencies head-on. It combines technical control measures, ongoing monitoring, contingency plans, operating practices, and strict project scheduling. The EMP is basically the ultimate binding rulebook that a project absolutely must follow to coexist with its environment.
Finally, part 6, review and final decision. We are now entering the climax of the EIA process, where the ultimate fate of the infrastructure project is decided.
The final 3 steps are documentation, review, and decision-making. Step 9 involves compiling a massive, incredibly detailed draft record. I mean, everything goes in here. The scoping, the consultations, the baseline data, impact methodology, alternatives, mitigation, the EMP, along with all the interpretations justifying the project. Then, in step 10, independent experts review this giant report to evaluate its quality. If anything is missing, they demand modifications. And finally, in step 11, the competent decision-makers review all those expert recommendations and make the final call on the future of the proposed project. So while this whole process is highly academic and heavily regulated, the real-world stakes affect every single one of us. This 11-step framework ensures that human progress doesn't come at the cost of irreversible ecological collapse. It forces transparency, it demands scientific rigor, and most importantly, it gives local communities and the environment a genuine voice in the boardrooms where billions of dollars are being spent. By structuring our understanding of the EIA, we can clearly see that modern infrastructure isn't just some triumph of engineering. It's a carefully negotiated treaty with nature. So the next time you see a massive new infrastructure project popping up in your city, whether it's a bridge, a factory, or a new transit line, ask yourself, what specific environmental compromises were weighed, measured, and agreed upon to build your world? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you in the next one.